I woke up in the ICU with the lights blurring above me and the sound of my children arguing just outside my door. Daniel's voice was sharp, pushing for the biggest share of my estate. Rebecca fired back, saying they should wait, even though her eyes drifted toward the documents in his hand. And Luke, he stood in the corner silent, hurt, watching them fight over a future that depended on whether I lived. In that moment, I understood everything. When I finally recovered, I changed it all. But before I continue, please subscribe and tell me where you're listening. Now, let me take you back to where it began. My name is Michael Harris. I am 62 years old, born and raised in Portland, Oregon. I am not the kind of man who lived a loud life. I worked hard, kept my head down, and built what I could, one small step at a time. Over the years, I invested in real estate, bought land others ignored, and opened a few coastal lodges along the Oregon shoreline. People say $20 million is a fortune. To me, it was just the result of decades of early mornings, late nights, and steady choices. I lived alone in a cedar house not far from the water. My wife, Anna, passed 6 years ago. Since then, everything had felt quieter, almost too quiet at times. I kept going by keeping myself busy. I fixed old fences. I visited the lodges. I took long drives with no destination. It helped me avoid the one truth I never said out loud: I missed her, more than I ever admitted to anyone. My children were grown. They each carried pieces of me in them, though not always the parts I expected. Daniel, my oldest, was 38. He came into the world with a sharp mind and a sharper desire to win. Even as a boy, he treated life like a race. He built a business, expanded fast, and pushed himself harder than anyone asked him to. For a long time, I believed he was the one who would understand me best. But somewhere along the line, his ambition grew into something colder. It began to take up space in every conversation we had. Rebecca, my middle child, was 34. She had a soft heart, gentle eyes, and a way of trying to keep peace, even when it hurt her. She became a mother, worked part-time, and tried to balance her own life with the expectations placed on her by her husband's family. She was kind, but also easily influenced. And when two strong voices pushed around her, she tended to bend, even if she didn't want to. And then there was Luke, 29. My youngest, the one who walked down a different road. He wasn't interested in business or money. He painted, wrote music, took temporary jobs, and lived in a tiny apartment downtown. Some people called him lost. I never did. He only wanted a life that made sense to him. He never moved fast, never pushed, never demanded. Sometimes he worried me, but his heart was steady, and his presence was gentle. Before the storm, my days were simple. I made coffee. I checked messages. I walked to the mailbox, even when there was nothing inside. Life was plain, but it was mine. I felt weaker here and there, a little tired, a little breathless on the stairs. I chalked it up to age. I never imagined it was the beginning of something bigger. If I had known that one afternoon would be my last moment of full consciousness before the ICU, I might have called one of my children just to tell them I loved them. But the truth is, all three of them were busy living their own lives. Busy chasing their own concerns, busy fighting for things that, at the time, I didn't even know they wanted. The signs began quietly. Daniel called less to ask how I was, and more to talk about business moves. He wanted to know which properties I planned to keep, which ones I might sell, how I valued each asset. His questions grew more detailed, more pointed. A part of me wondered why. Another part chose not to see it yet. Rebecca visited one weekend. She looked tired. She talked about her daughter's school, her husband's job, family schedules. Then, almost in passing, she asked if everything in my estate was organized. When I raised an eyebrow, she quickly added that she was just worried about avoiding future confusion. Her voice was soft, but her eyes avoided mine. Luke, on the other hand, he came by with a loaf of bread from my favorite bakery, sat at the table with me, and didn't bring anything up except how I was feeling. He asked if I had been sleeping well, if I needed any help, if I wanted company for dinner the following week. He didn't mention money. Not once. It was so ordinary, so small, that I didn't realize how rare it was until later. You see, the difference between genuine care and financial expectation can be quiet. It can hide in tone and timing and how someone looks at you when they think you're not paying attention. Back then, I felt something shifting, but I couldn't name it yet. Sometimes late at night, I sat alone in my living room, the sound of the ocean humming through the window. I thought of Anna. She had always known how to read people. She could sense storms before they formed. I wondered what she would have said if she had been here. Maybe she would have noticed the unease before I did. But the truth is, I did notice. I just didn't want to believe it. As the days passed, the cracks grew wider. My phone buzzed more often. Daniel asking questions about future plans. Rebecca suggesting we should talk as a family about long-term arrangements. Their voices carried something I couldn't ignore anymore, a pressure that did not belong to love. Yet through all of that, life kept moving. I kept pretending nothing was wrong. I told myself families have complicated moments. I told myself it was normal. But deep down, something heavy settled in my chest, a quiet fear of what might come next, and it came faster than I expected. Looking back now, the heart attack was not the first shock. It was only the one that forced everything into the open. The real storm had already started. It just needed one spark, one careless moment, to set everything on fire. And that moment arrived a week before everything changed. But that is part of the next turn in this story. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind you don't expect to hold any meaning. I had spent the afternoon fixing a loose hinge on the back gate, then poured myself a small cup of tea. My chest felt a little tight, but I brushed it off. I thought rest would help. I never imagined that night would plant the seed for everything that followed. Daniel called and asked to take me to dinner. His voice sounded warm, almost careful, and for a moment I felt something soften inside me. I told myself maybe he just wants to spend time together. I wanted to believe that. We met at a small restaurant he knew I liked. Candlelight. Soft music. He asked about work. The lodges. Whether the managers were handling everything well. It all felt normal. But then, the conversation shifted. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said, "Dad, we need to talk about your will." Just like that. No pause. No softness. No question about my health, even though I had been moving slower for weeks. He didn't ask if I was tired. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He asked about the end. I felt the air change. The room felt smaller. I tried to keep my voice steady, but a cold edge built inside my chest. I asked him why he was bringing this up now. He said it was responsible planning. He said he just wanted to help. But his eyes, they didn't match the words. They held a different weight, a quiet urgency. When we finished eating, he hugged me, but it felt automatic, like a gesture he performed because it was expected. I drove home with a heaviness I couldn't shake. The next morning the phone rang. It was Rebecca. Her voice trembled slightly, as if she was nervous, but the words were sharp enough to cut. "Dad, can we talk about your estate? 2 days. 2 children. The same topic." I asked if something happened. She said no, but she wanted to make sure things were fair. Then she mentioned Luke. She didn't say it directly, but her tone carried a message she didn't think he should receive much. She kept talking, explaining, justifying, but all I heard was the space between her words. The same cold urgency I'd seen in Daniel. The same push. The same fear that money might slip out of her hands if she didn't act fast. After we hung up, I sat still for a long time. I felt older than I had the day before. It was the first real crack in something I thought was unbreakable. I tried to shake it off. I tried to remind myself that they were my children, that people say things they don't fully mean. But the doubt stayed. It sank into my chest like a slow weight. Then, Luke came. No phone call. No agenda. He just showed up with a loaf of bread from my favorite bakery. He said he was in the area and wanted to check on me. He sat at the table, broke the bread, handed me a piece, and asked if I was doing okay. Not my estate. Not my properties. Not my will. Just me. He talked about a small art project he was working on. He asked if I wanted to go on a short walk later in the week. When he looked at me, I felt seen, not measured. And when he left, a different kind of weight settled in me, a painful one, because the contrast between my children had never felt wider than it did in that moment. It was the first time I wondered, do they care about me or the life I built? I didn't have an answer yet. I wasn't ready to face it. Instead, I buried it deep inside and pretended everything was still fine. But the truth was already moving, quietly, carefully, shifting the ground beneath my feet. What I didn't know was that the spark had already landed, and soon the fire would grow so fast I wouldn't have time to catch my breath. And the first flames appeared in the most unexpected way, through the people I trusted most. The days after those conversations felt strangely heavy, as if the air around my home had thickened. I went about my routine, but something inside me had shifted. I started noticing small details I once ignored. The way my phone buzzed more often, the tone my children used when they spoke to me, the pauses that carried hidden meaning. It was quiet at first, almost harmless, but step by step, the ground beneath me began to move. And the shift came through words. Not shouted words, not angry words, just careful ones, heavy ones, ones that didn't belong to love. It started with an email from Daniel. He wrote that he wanted to organize things ahead of time and that it would be helpful if I sent him my financial files, property deeds, investment records, business valuations. He said it was just preparation, nothing urgent. But preparation for what I read the message twice, then a third time. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. I didn't reply. I simply closed my laptop and sat still, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, trying to calm the uneasy beat of my heart. 2 days later, Rebecca called. She tried to sound gentle, but her voice trembled when she mentioned Luke again. She said he wasn't stable enough to handle a large share of anything. She said it with politeness, but I heard the undercurrent. I heard the fear. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing money. And that was the moment something inside me cracked in a way I couldn't ignore. I had raised my children to stand up for one another, to protect the family we had, to hold each other when times were hard. But now, they were quietly positioning themselves, measuring, calculating, whispering, and the whisper grew louder. I learned later that the next move happened behind my back, but even before I knew the details, I felt the distance forming. The second escalation came suddenly, unexpected, and yet somehow predictable. One afternoon, my lawyer, William, called me. I had known him for almost 30 years. He was calm, steady, never rushed. But that day his voice carried a hint of tension. "Michael, your son reached out to me." I stopped breathing for a moment. "About what?" I asked. "Your will," he replied gently. "He said you wanted to update it, but the way he spoke, it didn't sound like the request came from you." A quiet silence stretched between us. I felt something cold move through my chest. "And Rebecca contacted me as well," he added. I closed my eyes, took a slow breath, and let the truth sink deeper. They were moving together, not by accident, not by coincidence. Together. I thanked him, told him not to take any action, and hung up. After the call, I sat on the edge of my bed, hands resting on my knees, staring at the floor as the late afternoon light slipped across the carpet. My children weren't just thinking ahead. They were preparing, planning, trying to move pieces around me, as if I were no longer capable of making decisions. The next sign came only a few days later. Daniel visited unannounced. He walked in with the confident stride he always had, talking fast about business, about opportunities, about things I had no energy to follow. But then he paused, lowered his voice, and said something that made my heart sink. "Dad, maybe it's time to sell the coastal cabin. It would make things easier later. Cleaner, easier, later." He said those words so casually, as if he were talking about rearranging furniture instead of dismantling a part of my life. That cabin was where Anna and I spent our summers, where the children learned to swim, where we kept old photographs and handmade decorations. Selling it would not have made anything cleaner. It would have erased memories. But he didn't see that. Or maybe he did, and simply didn't care. I looked at him, studying his face, the calm certainty in his eyes. He was no longer speaking like a son. He was speaking like a man preparing to divide something he thought was already his. When he left, I felt a kind of silence fill the house, deep, heavy, impossible to ignore. Then came the moment that broke something inside me. It happened by accident. I had gone to the law office to drop off a document for William, something unrelated. As I walked down the hall, I heard familiar voices. I froze before I reached the door. Daniel and Rebecca were inside, talking to William, without me. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard enough. Luke shouldn't have access. Better for the family if we simplify. Dad will understand eventually. No need to tell him yet. My hand trembled on the doorknob. I had never felt such a mix of disbelief and sorrow. They were not only discussing my estate, they were actively trying to shape it, excluding their brother, rearranging my life's work for their convenience. I stepped back, walked quietly down the hall, and left the building without a word. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the dashboard, listening to the faint rhythm of my own breath. That night, my chest tightened again, sharp, deep, a pressure I couldn't ignore. I told myself it was stress. I told myself I just needed rest. But something inside me knew. It was more than that. And I was right. The heart attack hit me like a sudden wave. One moment I was reaching for a glass of water. The next I was on the floor, unable to call for help, the world blurring around me. When the paramedics arrived, I drifted in and out, catching flashes of light, voices, movement, and then darkness. Cold, quiet. Still, I woke up hours later in the ICU, unable to speak, unable to move, only able to hear. And through that fog, through that fragile state between consciousness and silence, I heard voices right outside the door. Daniel, Rebecca. Not whispering, not crying, arguing. They weren't discussing my condition. They weren't asking about my chances. They weren't worried about losing me. They were fighting about my $20 million estate. Rebecca's voice broke with frustration. Daniel's voice tightened with anger. And in the middle of that hallway, of that cold, sterile moment, where my life hung by a thread, they were dividing pieces of me, as if I were already gone. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, breathing through a tube, hearing everything with a clarity that pierced right through the fog. They thought I was unconscious. They thought I wouldn't remember. They thought I wouldn't understand. But my ears were clearer than my failing heart. And as their voices echoed through that hallway, something inside me began to change. Slowly, at first, then sharply, as if a lock had clicked open deep inside my chest, I realized the truth, a truth I never wanted to face, a truth that hurt more than the attack itself. My life's work meant more to them than my life, but that moment in the ICU, that cruel clarity, became the beginning of something else, a different kind of strength, a different kind of purpose, a different kind of quiet fire. The storm had taken everything from me, but it had also shown me exactly what I needed to see, and I would not forget any of it, not a single word, when the time came to take everything back. The days in the ICU passed in a strange blur, soft beeping dim lights, and the quiet rhythm of machines doing what my heart no longer could. I couldn't move much. I couldn't speak. I felt trapped inside my own body, drifting somewhere between waking and fading. But my hearing stayed sharp, clear, unforgiving. And through that stillness, I began to notice something the doctors never mentioned: the difference between footsteps. Some were light, careful, almost hesitant. Some were quick and patient, stopping right outside my door, only long enough to check a chart or make a comment about arrangements. And one night, when I thought I was alone, someone pulled a chair close to my bed. It was Luke. I didn't need to open my eyes to know. His breathing was soft. His clothes rustled like he had rushed there without thinking. And then I felt his hand wrap around mine. "Dad, I'm here." His voice cracked on the last word. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was just full of something I hadn't heard in a long time: fear. Not fear of losing money or stability, but fear of losing me. He talked to me about the sunsets he saw from the hospital parking lot, about a painting he was working on, about a bakery he wanted to take me to once I woke up. He read me a chapter from a book we used to enjoy. And when he thought I was sleeping, he whispered, "Please come back. I'm not ready to lose you." He came every night, every single night. Sometimes he stayed until dawn, his head resting on the edge of the bed. Sometimes he fell asleep in the chair, still holding my hand. Nurses tried to send him home, but he always returned the moment visiting hours opened. One evening, a young nurse named Elena leaned close to me. Her voice was gentle, like she had been waiting for a moment when no one else was around. "Your youngest son, he's the only one who comes like this," she whispered. "He doesn't ask about anything except your breathing and your comfort." She hesitated before saying the next words. "The others come too, but it's different. Different." I didn't need her to explain. I had heard enough in the hallway that first day to understand. But Elena wasn't finished. Her voice lowered a little, becoming cautious, almost troubled. "I wasn't supposed to hear this," she said softly, "but one day, your older son and daughter were talking near the nurses' station. They didn't know I was behind them." My chest tightened. She looked at the door, making sure no one was passing by. "They were talking about your estate," she continued, "and your son said, 'If Dad doesn't make it through this week, everything will be simpler.'" The room felt colder, quieter, smaller. Even though I couldn't move, something inside me recoiled. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone Elena described, calm, as if he were discussing a schedule, not a life. "And your daughter didn't disagree," she added gently. She sounded scared. But not for you. More like scared of losing her place. Elena placed a hand on my shoulder, soft and steady, as if grounding me in the truth she knew I needed. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know who came here out of love and who didn't. Her voice held no judgment, just sincerity. When she left, the silence in the room felt different, heavier, yet sharper. Like everything inside me had clicked into place. My children's footsteps told their own story. Daniel and Rebecca visited only when they needed updates, or when a financial question needed answering. Their words were polite, but their eyes flicked to the machines, to the monitors, to the chart at the end of the bed. Evaluating, estimating, waiting. But Luke, he stayed. He stayed even when he was exhausted. He stayed even when doctors suggested he get some rest. He stayed even when there was no hope of reaching me. And something inside me shifted. Something steady. Something new. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity. They weren't simply preparing for my death. They weren't simply afraid of losing money. They were hoping the burden of decision, the burden of division, the burden of questioning their own motives would disappear if I didn't wake up. If Dad dies this week. Those words echoed inside me like a cold drumbeat. I wasn't supposed to hear them. I wasn't supposed to remember them. But I did. And in that moment, with machines helping my heart and my youngest child quietly praying beside me, I made a decision. A quiet one. A patient one. A perfect one. If I survived this, if I made it out of that bed, I would take everything back. Not out of anger, not out of cruelty, but out of truth. They had shown me who they were, and I would respond in silence. I stayed quiet for a long moment after that. The room felt still, almost too still. I could hear the soft hum of the air system above me, steady and low, like a reminder that time was moving even when I wished it would stop. Part of me wanted to walk away from everything, to let the truth sit in the dark where no one could touch it. But another part of me, the tired part, the bruised part, knew I had already stepped too far to turn back. When I finally spoke, my voice came out softer than I expected. I told her I was ready, not because I felt brave, but because something inside me had shifted. Maybe it was the way the last piece of the puzzle sat in my mind. Maybe it was how the lies had become so loud I could hear them even in my sleep. Or maybe it was simply time. She nodded, slow and careful, like she was giving me space to breathe. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. She just waited, letting me set the pace. And when I started talking again, everything came out in one steady flow. I told her how the tension in the house had changed after that night. At first it was small moments. The quiet ones, the ones people usually ignore. Doors closing too sharply. Whispers that stopped when I walked by. The way someone would watch me from the corner of their eye, then look away the moment I turned. Those things used to make me doubt myself. But now, they formed a pattern I could finally name. And once I named it, I couldn't unsee it. I kept remembering the expression on her face in the room earlier. The way she looked at me like she knew something heavy was coming. It made me look back at my own memories with a new kind of light. A slow, steady light that didn't blind me, but exposed every shape, every shadow. I told her how I tried to keep calm on the outside. How I acted normal, walked around the house the same way, answered questions the same way. But inside, something was shifting. I began watching how people moved, how they spoke, how they avoided certain topics. Every small detail felt connected to something larger. There was one moment that stayed with me more than the others. It was a morning like any other. I was standing in the kitchen reaching for a glass when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, unhurried, the kind that someone takes when they think they're alone. When I turned, they froze. Just for a second. But that second, it was enough. Their eyes showed something real, something raw, something they tried to hide right after. And I knew in that moment that whatever they were planning, it had already started. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. I wanted to be sure. I needed to see the whole picture before I said anything out loud. So I kept quiet. I moved through the house like someone balancing on thin ice, careful with every step, listening for cracks. Every day the cracks grew louder. I looked back at her as I continued the story, and she gave me this small nod, as if she understood exactly what living like that felt like. And somehow, that nod made it easier to keep going. I told her about the documents. The ones I found by accident. The ones that didn't belong in that drawer or in that envelope, or under those folded towels. The ones with dates that didn't match the stories I had been told. The ones with signatures that felt too clean, too practiced. I didn't touch them for a long time. I just stared, letting the weight of them sit on my chest. But eventually I picked them up one by one, and everything started falling into place. I saw how the decisions had been made without me, how the conversations had been held behind closed doors, how the truth had been shaped into something that served only one person. And once I saw that, something inside me went still. Not angry, not frightened, just still, like standing in a quiet room after a long storm. I took a slow breath as I continued sharing it with her. I told her how I started noticing that someone would always be nearby listening without looking like they were listening. I told her how the phone calls would end the moment I stepped into the room. I told her how the papers in the office would shift places overnight. Not enough to be obvious, but enough for someone like me to sense a pattern. She leaned forward a little, not intrusive, just present. It made my voice come out steadier. I said that the moment everything clicked was the moment I realized I wasn't imagining anything. And that certainty, it felt heavier than the doubt ever did. I paused then. Not because I didn't know what came next, but because saying it out loud made it more real. The air felt thicker, warm around my shoulders. I let the silence sit between us for a breath, maybe two. Then I told her the part that had been pressing against my mind the most. The part that felt like the start of something larger and darker. The moment someone tried to change the plan without telling anyone. The moment they slipped and showed their real intention. And that intention was aimed at me. Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp. She just listened, calm, grounded, steady. And that steadiness made me find my own. I let out a slow breath and whispered the last thought I had before walking into her room earlier. That this wasn't an accident. That none of this started with me. But it might end with me, if I wasn't careful. I could feel part 7 already rising like a slow wave forming in the distance. So I softened my voice and let the words trail gently into the next turn. And that was the moment I realized I wasn't just uncovering the truth. I was stepping into something much deeper. Something I couldn't walk away from. Something that was already waiting for me in the next part. I think what stayed with me the most right after that realization was the quiet. Not the empty kind, but the kind that feels like something is shifting just beneath the surface. When I finished talking, she didn't move. She didn't rush to respond. She just watched me with this steady patience, like she knew I was standing on the edge of something I hadn't stepped into yet. And maybe that was why the next part of the story came out of me so slowly, almost like I had to hear myself say it before I could believe it. I told her that the days after that night felt strange in a way I couldn't explain at first. Not frightening, not dramatic, just different. Like the house had new rules no one had spoken aloud. People walked softer, doors closed quieter. Conversations dropped to a whisper before I even entered the room. And every time someone looked at me, I felt something sit behind their eyes, something they were trying to keep hidden. I didn't react. I didn't change my routine. I moved through each day like nothing was wrong, because I wanted to see how far they were willing to go if they thought I wasn't watching. And the more I watched, the clearer it became. Someone was preparing for something final, something that didn't need my agreement, only my silence. I told her how one morning while I was pouring a cup of water, I caught a reflection in the window. Someone stood behind me. Not close, but close enough to make my spine tighten. They weren't doing anything, just watching. And when I turned, they smiled, slow, polite, rehearsed. A smile that didn't touch anything real. It should have been a small moment, but it wasn't. Because in that smile, I saw the truth I had been avoiding. They were waiting for the right moment. Not to confront me, but to corner me. I kept my voice steady as I shared it. I didn't want the story to come out sharp or rushed. I wanted it to come out the same way I had lived it, quietly, moment by moment, breath by breath. I told her about the document I found the next day. It was tucked under a stack of envelopes, carelessly placed like someone had assumed I wouldn't look. But I did. Maybe because I had learned to notice things out of place. Maybe because they had become bold, too bold. When I opened it, my hands felt cold. Not shaking, just cold. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a form I recognized. It was a decision made in my name, without my consent, without my knowledge. A decision that shifted everything, financial, Details, responsibilities, rights, quietly sliding pieces of my life into someone else's hands. I stared at the page for a long time. The words weren't loud. They were simple, ordinary. But the meaning behind them settled in my chest like a slow, heavy weight. When I told her this part, she leaned in slightly, not interrupting, just listening, with a softness that made it easier to keep going. I said the hardest thing wasn't the document itself. It was realizing how long they had been preparing for that moment, how many steps had been taken behind closed doors, how many choices had been made without ever speaking to me. And the part that hit me the deepest was that someone had trusted I would be too distracted, too tired, too unaware to notice it all. But I noticed. I breathed slowly as I continued, because the next piece of the story always felt like walking through a narrow hallway. I told her about the late evening when I heard my name through the walls, soft, rushed, almost fearful. I stepped closer, not enough to be seen, just enough to understand. They weren't talking about me as a person. They were talking about me as a problem, a detail, a variable, something they needed to manage. I didn't hear every word, but I heard enough to know they weren't planning for peace. They were planning for control. She didn't look shocked. She just looked careful, as if weighing each word I spoke. And that made me feel something loosen inside my chest. It's strange how simply being heard can steady a person. I took one more breath before sharing the last part. I told her that the moment I truly understood what was coming was the moment I realized they weren't waiting for me to step into their plan. They were waiting for me to stop noticing it. And I wasn't going to give them that. The room felt still again. The same stillness I felt earlier. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was clear, focused. I looked at her and said quietly that everything was building toward a point one they thought I wouldn't reach. And as I felt part 9 rising inside me, I let my voice fall to a soft pause. Because the truth wasn't just unfolding anymore. It was about to break open. After everything I told her, after all the quiet moments, the slow shifts, the truths that rose one by one, there was only one place the story could go. Not back, not sideways, forward, straight into the part of my life I still revisit with a mix of sadness and a strange kind of peace. When I finally walked out of the hospital and into my home again, it didn't feel like the place I left behind. It felt lighter, cleaner, not because anything had changed inside the house, but because something had finally changed inside me. I was no longer pretending, no longer hoping they would return to who they once were. I was simply seeing things as they were. Luke moved gently around the house those days. He cooked for me, watered the plants, walked with me when my legs felt weak. He didn't speak about the documents, or the recordings, or the decisions I made. He didn't ask what I planned to do next. He only asked if I wanted tea, or if I wanted to sit on the porch for a few minutes, or if the sunlight was too bright on my face. And those small questions meant more than any grand gesture ever could. Daniel and Rebecca kept their distance for a while. I think they didn't know how much I remembered. They didn't know whether I had heard their hallway conversations, or the words Daniel whispered in the ICU, or the plans they made behind closed doors. But eventually, they came. Not together, not with softness, with worry, the wrong kind. Worry about what they might lose. Daniel arrived first. His voice was warm at the door, cold at the table. He asked how I was. He asked if I needed anything. But his eyes were searching, checking corners, scanning shelves, looking for clues about what I had changed while he waited for the old version of me to return. He didn't find what he hoped for. Then Rebecca came 2 days later. Her tone was quieter than his, but she carried the same question beneath her words. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap as if afraid that letting them go would reveal everything she had done. I didn't confront them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind them of what they said or didn't say. I simply lived and let the silence answer what they never dared to ask aloud. Weeks passed. My strength returned, slowly. My pulse steadied. My mind felt clearer than it had in months. And one morning, while the sea breeze drifted through the window, I realized something important. I didn't want bitterness to follow me into the years I had left. I didn't want revenge to be the only thing they remembered when they thought of me. I wanted truth. Just truth. The kind that didn't shout, but settled. So I invited them back. All 3. Together. One more time. They stood in my living room, Daniel stiff, Rebecca anxious, Luke quiet near the window as I explained that I was giving them something final. Not another chance, not another warning, just clarity. I told them that Luke would be living with me in the coastal home, learning real estate from me the way I learned it decades ago. I told them he would help care for me on weekends, and that I wanted to rebuild our life together in a way I never had the chance to before. I told them that their inheritance was no longer part of the discussion, not because I hated them, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I needed peace, and peace could not grow where greed had taken root. I watched their faces as the truth settled. Daniel's expression tightened. Years of ambition, plans, and silent expectations tightened with it. He didn't speak at first. He only stared at the floor, then at me, and then back at the floor again. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a bitterness he didn't bother hiding. "So this is it," he said. "You're choosing him?" I shook my head, slowly, calmly. "I'm choosing peace," I replied. Rebecca tried to soften the moment, but the fear in her voice made her words tremble. She asked if things could change, if I could reconsider, if time could repair what happened. I told her time could heal people, but not intentions. And the intentions I heard in the ICU hallway were not ones I could forget. Luke didn't say a word during any of it. He didn't gloat. He didn't shift his weight proudly. He simply stayed beside me, steady and quiet, offering a presence that felt more like family than any promise of money ever could. When Daniel and Rebecca left, they did so slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the house held answers they still hoped to find. But the answers weren't in the house. They were in the choices they made, long before I ever opened my eyes in the ICU. Their consequences unfolded in the weeks that followed. I didn't push them. Life did that on its own. Daniel's business strained without the financial stream he once depended on. The cost of his ambition began to show. His wife grew tired of the pressure, the arguments, the quiet resentment he carried home. Eventually, she stepped away, not to hurt him, but because she could no longer recognize the man he had become. Rebecca faced her own losses. Support from her in-laws faded when they learned the truth about what she and Daniel tried to do. Her place on the charity board was revoked after her behavior was reviewed not by me but by people who witnessed her choices long before I knew they existed. They didn't fall apart. They didn't break. They simply faced the weight of their own actions, without me holding it for them anymore. And Luke stayed. He learned my routines. He learned the business. He helped me rebuild days that had once felt empty. Sometimes he brought his art into the dining room and worked while I read. Sometimes we talked about his mother. Sometimes we sat in silence and let the ocean carry our thoughts. I told him once that I didn't choose him because he was the youngest, or the quietest, or the kindest. I chose him because, in the moment, my life hung by a thread. He held my hand, not my future. And that kind of love is rare. If there is a lesson in all of this, it isn't about money. It isn't about revenge. It isn't about punishment. It's about revelation. Money doesn't change people. It shows them. It pulls back the curtain and tells you who stayed for love and who stayed for the life you built. If you ever found yourself lying in an ICU bed, listening to the people you love speak about your future as if you weren't breathing, would you ever see them the same way again? If this story made you think, like, share, and subscribe, thank you for staying until the end.